Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Master's Apprentice, learning to be like Jesus. My name is Caleb.
And you know it, I'm Dustin.
You know it by now, baby. At least we hope so. um, Last week, we started talking about our background, our church background, and how we grew up in a movement called Independent Fundamental Baptists, which, for the simplicity of our conversation, we'll refer to as IFB. It's way simpler that way. Um,
And
and
faster.
we and faster. It'll be a time saver. It'll end up becoming a tongue twister at
Yeah.
some point. But last week we talked about some of the positive takeaways that we had with our church background, our Christian background, and that in many ways it's a privilege to have a conversation at all about today about the negative impacts or experiences in regards to the IFB. But to be able to have the conversation at all is a privilege in the sense of the Christian positives that we did pull from our experience.
Yeah.
And so if you missed that last week, we encourage you to go watch that first. That kind of tone better going into our negative conversation today. Any other introductory things you want to say, Dustin, before we dive in?
Um, I think as we did with the last episode, want to reiterate again that this is just our story,
Yeah.
right? And as we jump into the negatives, we want to be very aware that what we have experienced is our story, and you may be in a spot that these negatives that we are bringing up may not necessarily be true. Um, However, I would say that we want to be slightly stronger on this side of things
Yeah.
to say that while this is our story and it may not necessarily be yours, these are issues that we feel strongly on that is an issue with the movement as a whole.
Yeah.
And you may have found a pocket that it may not be true, and that is great. But if you're in this long enough, in this movement long enough, it's hard to deny that this is not an issue for the movement.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. Yes, I would. And so to just kind of speak into what you just said, I would say I would echo that and say the issues that we're talking about, there's a sense in which we don't want to isolate them just to our experiences, but we want to be honest and say that we believe that it's an issue. These are issues that permeate the whole movement. And once again, maybe you happen to be in a pocket that has dodged some of this, or at least maybe it's not as noticeable,
Right.
and totally get that. But once again, I'll repeat what you said, which is if you're around it long enough, and especially interact with the broader aspects of the movement, you will notice these things.
Yeah.
I meant to mention this. Why are we having this conversation, right? So we ended up at the end of our spiritual disciplines, reviewing those with community, and we want to talk more about the importance of having healthy community. And so part of that is knowing, what does a healthy community look like? What does a healthy church community not look like? And so on our journey there, we think it'll be helpful for you to know what our journey has been, our positives, our negatives, and kind of where we have landed. And just want to kind of put that out there to be a help to you guys with that. Because finding a church community can be a big task. And what are you looking for? Like, what do I look for? What are and what are the red flags of this not being a healthy church community? And so,
Yeah.
it's important to kind of know those things. And
Yeah.
once again, our story might be a little bit different than yours. But maybe this is all new to you. Maybe you're a new Christian, or like you're just kind of thinking about this whole thing and you're looking for a church community, whether to explore faith, whether to
Right.
explore Jesus, or maybe you're a new believer. And if you happen to click on this video, we want to encourage you. There are healthy, amazing, thriving Christian communities that you can be a part of.
Yeah.
But there are things that you can watch out for, and we want to encourage you with that. So, all right. Well, we have a list of overarching categories or topics, and so, and once again, maybe your experience, what you'd think of other things that you could put on this list, but these are kind of 6 overarching ones that we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, I would like to. I don't know if we would necessarily. Well, I feel like these are deal breakers when we're talking about finding a healthy community.
Okay,
But
well, that's helpful.
I feel like this list is not an all-inclusive list,
Right.
but it is a list of, okay, if I'm trying to find a healthy community, I feel like these are, for me anyway, these are some non-negotiables, and it's just some things that we had an issue with. We both have had in our stories had issues with, and what ultimately led us to going somewhere else, to a different community. And we both started communities of our own, so
there is that.
There is that.
We'll talk about that in a future episode.
We will, but I just wanted to make sure that it is our story. There's more that we could probably say, but we wanted to make sure that we just got these down and covered, because these were big deals for us. Yeah. I think you would agree with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, without further ado, we can jump in. I think the first negative on the list would be when it comes to the pastor. There's this persona of the man of God that's attached to the pastor.
Yeah.
And with that was a lack of accountability.
Right.
And what I mean by that is not only from just the people, but in general, it was always a man. Yeah. It was never multiple people. And even if you had some kind of leadership, quote, in place, it was yes men, or they had no real ability to approach the pastor and tell him he was wrong on something. And so
you're allowed
me,
to do that?
I think, right, exactly. Exactly. So the pastor, he was seen as the man of God. There was this persona, and he could not be questioned. There is no accountability at all. And so if you want to jump in here, Caleb, and start with some of your thoughts, I'll come behind that. But that would be the first one on the list for me.
Yeah. So how I'll come at this one is, once again, we would say it's not that there might not be a pastor of an IFB church that welcomes accountability, or has some sort of plurality of leadership or some sort of accountability in the church. But we would say this is something that permeates the movement. Right. So if you happen to dodge a bullet there, you're really lucky, because the odds of that happening are really high of the man of God persona. Another way of thinking of that is this, how I've explained that is, it's there within the movement. It's almost taught like they're an Old Testament prophet with special authority given by God to make ultimate decisions on stuff. So here's the words that should horrify you. And I'm a pastor, and I'm a solo pastor, right? So the words that, if someone were to ever say this to me, and I've heard people say it to others, is they say, "Whatever you want, pastor."
Yeah.
And this is outrageous.
Yeah.
It's outrageous. Maybe you're like, what are you talking about? Isn't that normal? No, that is really unhealthy.
Yeah.
The church is not about whatever a pastor wants.
Right.
What I want, Dustin, as a pastor, is completely irrelevant.
Right.
The question is, what does Jesus want?
Right.
As prescribed in his word.
Right.
It's not about that. So that's how I'd like to speak into that. So it's this. Once again, I'll repeat what you said, that in the worst of cases, it's like the a sin to ask a question of,
Yeah.
wait, didn't the pastor mean this when he said that? Um, or to even push back was looked at as going against God sometimes. Like it was almost that
Right.
significant. And once again, the example of it is the Old Testament prophets having this special authority from God. You see that in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That's not what a New Testament pastor is by even a
Yeah.
little stretch of the imagination. And so
Yeah.
the worst stories I've heard, Dustin, abuses of this,
Yeah.
which there's a whole spectrum of abuse
Right.
that we could talk about, but I'll start with one of the more lighthearted abuses of this is like, this is what you're in for if you buy into this man of God idea where he does what he does. He's the pastor. I should just do whatever he wants because he's the
Yeah.
pastor. Is um, the worst, not the worst, but one of the bad outcomes it could be is I've heard of stories where a pastor would say something like, if you go against the man of God, then God's going to make harm come to your family or to your life.
Yeah.
And outrageous,
Yeah.
like outrageous. That's the type of emotional manipulation that can happen. Is it's
Yes.
threatening. If you leave
It
this
is.
church or disagree with the
Yes.
pastor, you're going against God, and God's going to be against you if you do this.
Yeah.
And so, once again, lots of different stories you could go with that, starting with just emotional manipulation. But
Right.
red flag, if if you're at a church community or looking for a church community and you see that no one is allowed to push against the pastor, or if the pastor has to
Yes.
control everything and oversee
Yeah.
everything and micromanage everything,
Yes.
these are major red flags, because church is community surrounding around Jesus, not around any other person.
Right.
And so it's a misplaced understanding of the role of leadership in the church, which that might be a separate conversation to talk about, Dustin, because we could spend a long
Sure.
time talking about what should that look like. But
Sure.
anyway,
Sure.
what else would you want to say on this? I have
Well,
lots of things I
I
could
would,
say, but I'll push it back to you for
yeah.
now.
I,
I
I
haven't come
agree.
out guns blazing yet. I'm being like really gentle so far. I'm being good.
We, we all have those stories that we've either heard or actually experienced personally.
Right.
Um, I, I can remember there's been a couple of times, whether it's, on a sermon or something, it was obvious that the pastor's authority had been questioned, or the direction that he was wanting to go had been questioned, and that turned into the hot topic for a sermon next week,
Mm-hmm.
where we go to King Saul and David illustration, and King David had the opportunity to kill Saul, and he said, "I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed," and then them making the reference that they were the Lord's anointed, and you better be careful when you touch the Lord's anointed kind of
Mm-hmm.
scenario.
Mm-hmm.
The manipulation on that is unreal.
Yeah.
And people are sitting there and they are taking it and
Yeah.
still staying with someone who is obviously got an ego problem
Right.
and is trying to manipulate, which
Yep.
that unfortunately happens way more often
Yep.
than we would than even some people even realize. And
Yeah.
it's not even as blatant as that. It can just
Right.
be, it can be small things, but that whatever you say, pastor, you're the man of God, you obviously are hearing from God more than I am, so I'm going to just defer to you because you are the
Yeah.
pastor. Kind of, it can
Yeah.
lead to, there's something that you said while we were kind of prepping for this, and I don't want to steal your thunder on it, but it was
God,
so good. I've never heard it. I saved it just in case you forgot to say it. But there, and this may kind of change the direction of this conversation, so I apologize if you wanted to say more. But
it's all good.
there are there are monsters that are out there that come into these spaces and they take over. They see an opportunity, and then there are situations where the monsters are actually created.
Yes.
And even people and pastors with the best intentions, pastors who want to love God and want to, in their worldview and in their context, they want to follow God and they want their people to follow God. You give them on a silver platter all authority, no questioning at all. That turns
Yep.
even the best of people into monsters
Yeah.
because there's no accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is, to a certain level, the fact that there are just monsters out there, and they get into these churches and they start manipulation from day one, and it's
Yep.
just an awful situation.
Yep.
But there's also some accountability on the people and the structures that are in place
Right.
to allow these people, these pastors, free reign.
Yeah.
And if your church is set up for that, it's just a recipe for disaster. No matter how good the person is, no matter how pure their heart is,
Right.
it's just a matter of time.
Right. And so it can start out seemingly innocent, right? So if we go down the trail of, let's say you have a pastor who's this good man who has a good intentions of wanting to point people to Jesus, and then every day, week after week, year after year, the IFB congregation who has embodied this idea as a good thing, and it isn't.
Right.
The man of God syndrome. Every day saying, whatever you want, pastor, whatever you want, pastor. I think this, but whatever you want, pastor. Then if the church were to ever be like, oh, pastor, we actually don't like this anymore, then he can say, but you said whatever I want, right? I'm the man of God, right? And so, and you gave that to him. So now different IFB churches, their structure might be a little different. There is a little bit of nuance to like governance.
Yep.
But let me tell you, we cannot just very adamantly talk about the wrongness of a man setting himself up as a prophet over the congregation, the anointed one, and lording over people because they're emotionally dependent on people being emotionally dependent on them.
Yes.
Awful, bad. At the very same time, congregations let them do it.
Yeah.
Or create them. Or hire them to do it.
Yes. Yes.
And so we cannot have a one-way street on this. And so I will talk just as harshly. If you're some IFB churches don't even have associate pastors. Some don't even have deacons. Some are just the congregation. So one church that I was a part of for a while was just congregational with no deacons and one senior pastor. So it like even separated it even more in this hierarchy. It's like congregation, and then the man of God over here tells everybody how to live their lives. Okay, so really bad scenario. So, but congregation is part of the problem. If we just, I don't like it, but okay, he's the pastor.
Right.
Like that is so, there's got to be shared accountability, responsibility for that. And so, like if you have a deacon board or deacon group that's kind of also part of the accountability team with that, some IFB churches have that as well. Yeah. How you can't like say yes to everything the pastor says and then blame him for all the stuff that he did without taking any responsibility with him.
Right.
And so that's an important thing to point out, is that this isn't attack pastor mode. Because Dustin and I aren't anti-leadership and anti-pastor. um, Leadership in the church is a vital role in the health of a local community. It's a biblical role, but we're talking about the abuse of it, the manipulation of it, but it's on the whole congregation, especially if you're a congregational church.
Right.
And that's what IFB churches are. They're congregational led churches. They vote on everything.
Yeah.
And I've seen it happen where almost everybody always votes yes because I don't want to go against pastor. And it's like,
Right.
well, what is that? And a bit of a transition on this, and I want to say this would be true in any setting. If you have kids, how dare you tell them that some other adult is always right? Even for yourself as a parent, how dare you tell your kids that you're always right, for crying out loud, for that matter.
Right.
But, oh, that's the man of God. Do whatever he says. He's always right. He's God's anointed. Because on the worst side of the spectrum, you're setting your kids up to be abused and manipulated in the worst of ways.
Yes.
And this has happened in the IFB movement. It's happened in other movements too. Other larger groups of people where things have happened and things have been covered up. But it's happened in the IFB as well because of the man of God. It's like, and so you set up your kids to be manipulated emotionally, to be abused physically, because, oh, I can't say anything. They're a man of God. They're an anointed. Like they can't, and so you cannot do that. You shouldn't. It's happened. But generally speaking, you probably wouldn't do that with the coaches of your sports team. You wouldn't do that with the teachers at the school. You wouldn't do that. Don't do that with pastors either. That's ridiculous because, once again, you're opening up the door for all kinds of atrocities. So
Evil.
Pure evil. And so what I'd say is, I'll dial back for 1 second. I'll dial back because we're getting into some stuff that can get very emotional and heated, and rightfully so. The worst of it is like, crimes committed and then police aren't called and, oh, let's just ship this pastor over to another state. That's happened. I want to mention that because we're never going to pretend like that hasn't happened. That's a thing that has happened in the IFB.
Happens often, unfortunately.
And so we're not saying that every IFB pastor is one of these types of people or right. We're saying that any church model that has a man of God persona, the idea that the pastor's the anointed one and whatever pastor wants, you're setting yourself up for the potential of the worst case scenarios. And it's all bad, even if it's on a low end, it's all bad, but you're opening up for even the worst of things that could happen to your congregation. So if you go into a church and you can clearly see the man of God syndrome, whatever pastor wants, run away from that.
Run away.
If you're in a congregation and you're like, wait a second, my church is kind of like this. Have some conversations about that and find out if that's really what your church is.
Yeah.
And what's going on. You'll find out really quick. And if the church isn't willing to push against that idea, I would also say run away. So yeah, I don't have anything really positive to say about it. It's all bad. There is no positive in the man of God persona, at all.
Yeah. I mean, best case scenario is that you encounter someone who is a pastor and is very proud, and we always do what he would like, even in preferences, and everybody's cool with that, but there is no pushback against him on anything, and that's a best case scenario.
Yeah.
It only gets worse from there.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the shipping off people in the middle of the night kind of deal. And while we don't want to get too technical and into that, but that goes right back to the accountability piece of, oh wow, we had this youth pastor and there's rumors of something happening with someone and he's not here anymore. But when we talked to
Mm-hmm.
pastor about it, he
Mm-hmm.
said it's a misunderstanding, and I guess
Mm-hmm.
it's the other person's lying. Like, I mean, there's no accountability,
Yep.
and that's like one of the worst case scenarios
Yep.
in this kind of environment.
And what I'll say on this is I don't want to. We could get really caught up into
Yeah.
it, and I'm fine with I'm really fine talking about it. But for the purpose of our longer conversation, we may not park on this too much longer. But I'll just say that there are some people within the movement that don't know, like the shipping off type thing and like covering the cover ups. And maybe that's like if you're watching this and you're in IFB and you're like, what are you talking about? You can find the information really easily. Like this is like,
Yeah.
like it's public information. It's not, it's not secret anymore. So,
Yeah.
so I, some within the movement have spoken out about it. But a very minute group have.
Yeah.
And so definitely not enough, because they all should be shouting from the rooftops of how awful that is and how unacceptable that it is, but they're not. So, and so that's a problem in and of itself if you're unwilling to publicly acknowledge the issues within your movement, within your group, and just be, oh, we don't talk about that because it's bad publicity. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Right.
and it's all of that's just that's yeah. So that one's close to heart for sure.
Yeah, it is. And before we move to the next one, I would just like to reiterate that you may be in IFB and you look at your pastor and you say, but they couldn't. They're not like that. They're so much better than that, right? What I'm telling you is that while that could be true, you are giving this person so much power and so much authority. It is an act of God that they don't take that to heart and run with it.
Yeah.
And if you are in that situation, you should be thanking and praising God that that pastor has not gone off the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that it won't happen.
Yep.
I mean, temptation is there.
Yep.
For everyone. And
Yep.
you can only take so much of that for so long without abusing
Yep.
in some way, shape, or form. And so while your pastor may not be the worst of the worst of covering up perverts, they still have this temptation of abusing their power.
Yep.
And there's no accountability.
Yep.
And that cannot be. A pastor is not a ruler and a dictator. A pastor is a shepherd.
Yep.
Like we're getting so far off course of what a pastor should be in the body.
Yep.
So anyway,
yeah,
I just wanted to point that out, that, you know, we're talking about the worst case scenario, and while your pastor may not be in that worst case scenario, if you're looking for a healthy church community,
yep,
you need to run the other way if you see this
yep,
persona, because it can only lead to bad at some point in time. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but it's coming.
Yep.
And I think we should move to the next one, because
we
could
probably
be here
should
for a long time.
we could still say a lot, and we know we could. So, what do we got next?
The next thing I've got here, it's a hot topic for both me and you, I think. But
oh boy,
there is no biblical context for preaching and teaching. I mean, this is tied to accountability to somewhat from the first one, but
yep,
a pastor can stand up and take a single verse and then go off on a tangent on whatever they want to talk about. And there's no context. They're missing the whole context. Case in point, I was telling Caleb a story, and I don't think anyone who would listen to this would know, so I feel comfortable saying it. There was a small little revival that was going on that I was taken to for a day. There was some speakers there, and the passage used was Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And, he's glowing, and the disciples are like, oh, wow, it's Moses and Elijah, right? And Peter says, man, it is good for us to be here, and talks about building, anyway, the pastor,
The man of God.
took the man of God took that verse, and for 45 minutes talked about why it was good for us to be here in the building at the place that the service was taken on. And the points that I remember involved, they were worshiping the correct way, which meant that there was no drums and that we were singing correctly, and that there was good preaching that was going on. And that is why it was good for us to be here.
Hey, man. Sorry.
And all of the amens and all of the hooting and hollering. And you look at the verse and you're like, that literally has nothing to do with what's going on here.
Yeah.
And yet it happens every single week in congregations all across IFB. And once again, this is not just strictly to IFB, but
right,
ripping things out of context to make a point that you want to make.
Yep.
Is not handling the Bible and Scripture correctly.
Yep.
And one day we'll be held accountable for that, I should add.
Yeah.
Like the Bible is very clear that there is a weightiness to anyone who handles the teaching of the Bible. There's going to be judgment on how we parse that out. And so that aside, there is such an abuse of this, taking the Bible and making it say whatever I want to say to make a point. It's outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really good, Dustin. I don't know that I have a lot to say on this one. I agree with everything that you said. I'll say this. Growing up, I had a way better experience than as opposed to some in regards to how the Bible was used. I'm not saying that it was perfect, but by any stretch of the imagination, I'm not trying to say that. But like there was like actually exegeting a text would actually happen, and exegete, in other words, like diving in and like what is the text telling us? What does it mean? I experienced a lot of that growing up. But the longer, once again, the longer I was in the movement and the more people I heard speak, that wasn't the case. It's like, so in this little pool that I'm in, like this is preaching and teaching, like going through like a text and like whatever. But most of my experiences outside of that little aspect of it being positive was really kind of wonky. It's like, I'm going to come in mad and I'm going to quote random verses to support the thing I'm mad about, except in context, those verses have nothing to do with what you're mad about. And so I was actually kind of taught to preach this way over time because of my being around that. Like I had this thinking of, oh, this is something I want to talk about. Let me find some verses to back it up. And the problem with teaching that way, preaching that way, is that you can teach on anything. Yeah. It doesn't have to be true or not. You just find a verse that kind of sounds like the thing that you want to talk about.
Yeah.
kind of a funny one, because once again, there could be really, really bad abuses of this in the worst of extremes.
Yeah.
But a funny one that I'll give is like when we were in college and we had to go to chapel 5 days a week. And so we got like the whole gamut of bad to worse when it comes to like IFB teaching. So in there's many senses in which we heard not necessarily maybe the best that IFB had to offer in teaching, right? Because there were some that, would actually exegete a text. It's like, oh, okay, they do exist. That's great. But most of it was like, I'll give an example. There was 1 week where like 3 out of the 5 said, I'm going to give you the secret of how to live the victorious Christian life. And you won't believe this, Dustin. They were all 3 different sermons.
Yeah.
With random verses thrown into it. And it's like, so which one of these guys is right? Which one has the secret sauce? Right. It's just like, and we could give lots of examples, I think, of like abuses of texts. A lot of one
preaching.
like, yeah, like one verse. And then it's like, I'm going to roll with this, or like, I'm going to roll off of one word and it not even have anything to do with the context. Probably the worst I ever heard of like zero context was, and we've talked about this before, was in chapel, someone was mad that some of the male students were letting their girlfriends wear their suit jackets. I don't know why they're mad about it, but they were mad about it. They thought that it was inappropriate for boyfriends to let their girlfriends wear their suit jacket. So in chapel, this guy preached an entire sermon, and you're probably not listening. I love you.
You know who you are.
but you know who you are. And those that were there know who I'm talking about. Preached an entire sermon about Joseph and his coat of many colors, and about how when Potiphar's wife tried seducing Joseph, what'd she do? She grabbed his coat of many colors, his special coat given to him by his father. And that's why you shouldn't give your coats to your girlfriends. So the 2 major issues with this sermon was, first of all, he no longer had the coat of many colors because
context tells us he didn't.
Context tells us that he didn't. It's like, have you read the story of Joseph? Because he didn't have the coat anymore. So that context would have helped. And this person should have known better. Like, this person really should have known better for that. And then the second, maybe I'm being too nice. And the second part of it was that it has nothing to do with a guy wearing a suit jacket and letting their girlfriend wear it.
Yeah.
This was a woman seducing a man and pulling his clothes off. I don't know what that has to do. What that has to do with a man voluntarily giving his girlfriend a jacket. So that would be another like humorous example. But at the same time, it's not funny because it was using a text inappropriately and their authority to emotionally manipulate people into thinking that they were doing something wrong.
Right.
So that's why these two go together. So you're an anointed man of God and you're using this text over here to manipulate me into feeling guilty about doing something that isn't even wrong.
Right.
Because you don't like it.
Right.
And so that's why those two go hand in hand together. So I can joke about it now, but it was completely inappropriate.
and to talk through the theme that we're trying to stay on is, if you are in a scenario in which there's these one-off kinds of sermons consistently where a verse is just taken and used to beat you over the head with, or a verse is taken way out of context and it has nothing to do with what's going on, and you've got a pastor who's up there ranting and raving on his pet things that he's wanting to talk about.
Yep.
Run the other way.
Yep.
That is not a healthy community.
Yep.
That is not a healthy way to look at the Bible. That's not a healthy way to interpret the Bible. And it teaches people when they read the Bible that they can just open the Bible, point to a verse, and whatever that verse says, you can take and apply however you want. Like, it just does not work that way. Mm-mm. And so you got to be in a part of a church family, a church culture that handles the Word of God seriously and carefully and will make sure to walk through context, it's vitally important. Um,
I think it's good for us to be here, Dustin.
it is good for us to be here.
Um,
I
I
don't
think
want
we
to
have
stay on this too long because there's
no.
so many bad
Yeah.
illustrations.
Yep.
Um,
Do we want to
the
move on to
last,
the last thing here?
yeah,
We
yeah, I was
we'll
gonna
we'll
say
have two parts to this. We'll have another episode next week, but we'll talk about one more today, and then we'll talk about three more next week. Right, Dustin? We have
yeah,
that straight.
yeah,
Okay. All
yeah.
right. Go ahead and hit us with this third one.
So this last one, wanted to touch on. There's only so much that me and Caleb can say, but we will share from our vantage point. It would be helpful to have a woman on to maybe talk about that
Yeah.
later, like
Yep.
maybe do a whole podcast on it
We'll,
later.
we'll get our wives on here and just have the two of them here talk it out.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be good if we can get them on. Um,
It'd be really hard to convince my wife to do that, but I would try.
um, a major issue in our background was the view and treatment of women.
Yeah.
Um, at best, you are in a semi complementarian church, which means essentially that women are equal to men. They just have different roles.
Right.
At best, that's the doctrinal statement. Whether that was lived out or not is another thing. But the doctrinal statement and view would be that men and women are equal, but they have different roles to play. At worst, you encounter this patriarchal kind of view of women that their place is in the kitchen and to have kids and be there for their husband. um, we get, if you ever have been a part of that kind of environment or community, it is so opposite what I see in the Bible. It is so opposite of what you see in Genesis, of how God created man and woman to both be there together. They were co-rulers of the earth, not like, and I'm definitely not getting into right now what role women should be in church, but I'm just saying that when you look at scripture, God saw man and woman together as one, not two.
Right.
Like man is elevated and woman is beneath him.
Right.
And yet there are so many churches who, whether they say it and live it out or they just live it out, they see women as second class.
Right.
And that's not the way it should be.
I like to talk about this. I'll say this first and I'll kind of dive into an aspect of this. So men and women are beautifully, uniquely different than each other. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The bad thing is that some people view that as a bad thing and try to demean one over the other. And historically, women have been the odd ones out on that. So, and in the IFB, once again, there's a spectrum to which your experience might have been with that. The thing that comes to mind in particular for me is the general teaching across the IFB. The one that I'm most passionate about. Once again, there's other parts of it, and maybe we could have someone else to talk on some of these things. But is that a man's lust problem is actually women's fault,
Right.
and that's horrendous. Like I can't even begin to express the horrendous teachings of that. So I'm going to make a really strong statement to tell you my teaching on this to make the point. If a if an attractive woman runs down my street stark naked and I lust after her, it's 100% my fault. I'm not saying that it's appropriate for her to run out in the street like
Right.
that, but it's my fault
Right.
for lusting, not hers.
Right.
Because contrary to IFB teaching or implication is that it's not my fault, really. Maybe it's 5% my fault if you're lucky, 10%, but it's really because of the immodestly dressed woman is the reason why that you lusted. So what would then happen is that now I can deny any accountability, responsibility for my thinking and for my actions. So what I can tell you, especially with the younger kids and the teenagers and the youth groups, the guys were never pulled aside and reprimanded for their evil hearts and for their lust issues.
Right.
But the girls were pulled aside and said, this is how long that your dress has to be, and this is too tight, and this is too short, because we don't want you to make the guys stumble.
Yeah.
And that is so demeaning towards women, to treat them as if your one goal in life is to make sure that you're not a stumbling block to men.
Right.
And men, I'll just keep doing what you're doing. So that's my experience with that. That's one of the key things that I find to be one of my pet peeves of in the movement would be that mistreatment of women. It would also, we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of it, but like there's also like the interaction of men and women together, where that's like looked at as bad and like you can't communicate with the opposite sex without it being something weird.
Right.
Once again, it's
a very over. I think if we were to characterize it, maybe a very over sexualized, view of women, and it's like you can't be alone with a woman for 2 minutes without something happening, right? Like it was like it was very much a we have to hide you as much as we can until you get married.
And primarily on the women, primarily on the girls.
No, exactly.
You know, I've heard like entire sermons about, you know, being the princess that stays up in the tower.
Yes.
But nothing about the prince staying in the castle. You know, like, what is going on here? Exactly. And so the reason why it's so backward, Dustin, the reason it's so backwards is because biblically, when it comes to sexuality and relationships, in the Bible, it's the men that are held to a high accountability and standard.
Yeah.
It's the men that are held to a higher standard, and a higher accountability and responsibility of how they treat women.
Right.
It's not girls, don't stumble. It's guys, don't treat women like dirt. Like that's what the Bible leads us into. So, any teaching or idea that denigrates women into thinking of them in one kind of way or over-sexualizing them and things being their fault because they're women, or even downplaying what they can do in ministry. And yeah, that's a whole other thing too.
Yeah. I feel like we could rant on that for a while, but I think we've made the point. It's if you find yourself in that kind of a community where women are seen as less than, if you find yourself in a community that it's all the woman's fault and no accountability on the man, if there's an over sexualizing of woman, then that is not a healthy place to be. Especially, well, I shouldn't say especially. It's not a healthy place to be if you're a man or a woman for different reasons.
Yep.
And so you got to get out of there. You got to go somewhere that sees men and women as equal
Yep.
Different, but equal.
Yep.
um, Gosh, we could spend some time here too.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of
Oh,
time,
yeah.
but
On a positive note, I was just teaching in Galatians and how Paul was, well, he used the human analogy because the cultural analogy, because in the Greek, in the Roman Empire, and this understanding is that, and this would be the case even in the Old Testament, but the firstborn sons are who got the inheritance,
right.
right? And then Paul makes this argument that in the kingdom of God, if you're in Christ, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you're both firstborn sons.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
And so, meaning that you're both equal heirs in Christ. You both get the inheritance in Christ. You both have equal footing with Christ. And that's how you should treat one another, and in the same way. So, not as second-rate citizens. Once again, that could be a whole episode on its own, and because it covers different things, whether you're talking about in the church, in the community, in marriage. Like, there's a lot we could talk about there. But yeah, that would be the third red flag, is how women are treated.
Well, I think we've exhausted our time here.
Yep, we have. I'm sorry if we didn't spend more time on something that you were hoping we'd spend more time on.
We can always circle back.
We can always circle back. Yep, because we in no way are trying to downplay any of these categories. We're not trying to sugarcoat anything.
Yeah.
And so in the comments, if you're thinking, why didn't you talk about this, or why didn't you dive into this, please feel free to share that, and maybe we will. We will see you guys next week as we dive into 3 more categories, and we hope to hear from you. Hope it's encouraging to you. We don't want to come across, even though we're talking about negative things, we're saying this in a way we hope that encourages you and helps you in finding a healthy church community. And we'll talk more about it next week.
See you then.